The natural world rarely appears dramatic at first glance. Forests stand quietly, oceans move in slow rhythms, grasslands sway with the wind as if nothing much is happening at all. Stability seems almost effortless, as though living systems simply exist in a permanent state of balance. But ecological stability is never stillness. Across every landscape on Earth, countless exchanges are unfolding continuously. Energy is moving from sunlight into leaves, from leaves into herbivores, from herbivores into predators, and eventually back into soil through decay. Nutrients circulate through air, water, and living tissue. Populations rise and fall. Species compete, cooperate, adapt, and sometimes disappear. None of this activity pauses even when it becomes invisible to human attention. An ecosystem remains stable not because nothing changes, but because change happens in ways that can be absorbed. Disturbances come and go. Storms reshape coastlines. Fires clear forests. Droughts strain rivers and roots alike. And yet, life often reorganizes itself, redistributing energy and relationships until a new balance quietly forms. This kind of stability can feel almost paradoxical. Systems that endure for centuries are constantly rearranging themselves from within. Forests that appear timeless are built from cycles of growth and decay. Coral reefs that seem permanent are the result of fragile biological partnerships renewed every moment. To understand ecosystems properly, it helps to let go of the idea that balance means perfection or permanence. In ecology, stability usually means the ability to continue functioning through disruption. It means flexibility rather than rigidity, movement rather than stillness. From this perspective, the living world becomes less like a machine holding steady and more like a conversation that never stops adjusting. Energy flows through food webs. Nutrients circulate through soil and water. Species interact in networks so complex that no single organism controls the outcome, yet patterns of order still emerge. Tonight's exploration is an invitation to look at ecosystems through that quieter lens, to see stability not as the absence of change, but as something produced by change itself, not as a frozen balance, but as an ongoing process shaped by energy, diversity, and resilience. Because once ecosystems are understood this way, the natural world begins to feel less like a collection of separate environments and more like a single living system, continuously finding ways to keep going. Hello, and welcome to Quiet Science. If calm, thoughtful journeys into how the natural world works help you relax or drift off to sleep, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And feel free to share in the comments where you're watching or listening from tonight, whether that's near forests, cities, oceans, or anywhere life is quietly maintaining its balance. Stability sounds like a promise, something that holds still, a lake that looks the same every morning, a forest that keeps standing year after year, a coastline that seems to ignore the weather even while the weather does its best to be dramatic. But in ecology, stability almost never means stillness. It means something quieter and stranger and more impressive. It means that life can keep going while everything is changing. An ecosystem is not a finished scene. It is a set of moving relationships that create a recognizable pattern for long enough that the human mind relaxes and calls it normal. Trees grow, compete, and die. Leaves fall. Insects chew. Birds arrive and leave. Fungi pull apart wood strand by strand. Nutrients shift between soil, water, and living tissue. Populations rise and fall. Even the chemistry of the air above a canopy is subtly reshaped by all that photosynthesis and respiration. The activity does not stop just because it becomes invisible. So the first task is to be clear about what stability actually means in ecological science, because it comes in several forms. One is resistance. Resistance describes how much an ecosystem changes when something pushes it. A highly resistant system can take a shock and barely budge. A less resistant system shifts quickly and visibly. Resistance is not automatically good or bad. A system can resist change for a long time, and then fail abruptly when the pressure crosses a threshold. Another is resilience. Resilience describes what happens after change has occurred. If drought, fire, storms, or disease knock parts of the system out of their usual pattern, resilience is the capacity to absorb that disturbance and keep functioning. In the work of the ecologist Crawford Stanley Holling, resilience is not simply bouncing back to the exact same state like a rubber ball. It is the ability to retain the same basic identity, the same core processes, and the same overall structure of relationships, even while reorganizing internally. There is also persistence, which sounds simple but matters a lot. Persistence asks whether a system or a species can remain present over time at all. A population can be persistent even if it swings wildly from year to year, as long as it keeps returning, and there is variability, which is often used as a practical way to measure stability. If ecosystem properties such as overall biomass, productivity, or nutrient cycling stay within a relatively narrow range across seasons and years, that can be taken as a sign of stability. The key detail is that it is always a range, not a single fixed point. This is why ecologists often talk about dynamic equilibrium rather than static equilibrium. Dynamic equilibrium means the system is in motion, but the motion has boundaries. A stable ecosystem is less like a statue and more like a river. The water is never the same water, but the river remains recognizably itself. This way of thinking was shaped strongly by systems ecology, particularly through the work of Eugene Odum. Odum helped frame ecosystems as integrated systems that process energy and recycle materials. That framing encourages a shift in attention. Instead of seeing a landscape as a collection of separate organisms, it becomes possible to see an ecosystem as a living network of energy transfers, constraints, and feedback. And once that shift happens, stability stops looking like a mystery and starts looking like an outcome. It is produced by mechanisms. It is maintained through constant work. And that work is paid for in energy. Every living thing runs on a budget. The entire ecosystem does too. Energy enters ecosystems mainly as sunlight. It is captured by photosynthesis, turned into chemical energy, and stored in organic molecules. From there, the ecosystem becomes a flowing transaction system. Energy moves from leaves into herbivores, from herbivores into predators, and from living tissue into waste. Eventually, it moves into decomposers when organisms die and their bodies become food for fungi, bacteria, and detritivores. Energy flow is not a side story, it is the story. Life is a way of staying organized in a universe that constantly pushes systems toward disorder, and that pushes written into thermodynamics. Ecosystems do not operate as perfect circles where everything loops without loss. Energy flows through, and at every step, some of it leaves the ecosystem as heat. That is why energy movement has direction. Materials can cycle. Energy cannot cycle in the same way. The base of this flow is primary production. Primary producers, including plants, algae, and cyanobacteria, use sunlight to build sugars and other organic compounds. On land, plants usually dominate this work. In the ocean, phytoplankton often do most of it. Even though they are so small, they vanish from view unless they gather in blooms. Ecologists describe this using concepts such as gross primary productivity, which is all the energy captured, and net primary productivity, which is what remains after the producers pay the cost of keeping themselves alive. Plants are not charitable. They keep a large share of their captured energy for respiration, growth, repair, and defense. What remains becomes available to primary consumers, and the same pattern repeats. Herbivores convert some of that energy into their own bodies, but much is lost through respiration, movement, heat, and waste. Predators eat herbivores. Parasites drain energy from hosts. Scavengers take leftovers. Decomposers take what remains. At each transfer, energy is transformed and some is lost. This is why top predators are always fewer than the plants that ultimately support them, not because predators are unpopular, but because the energy budget does not allow a stadium full of wolves supported by a single shrub. If asked to do that, the shrub would simply retire. This general picture was formalized in ecology by Raymond Lindemann, whose trophic dynamic theory described ecosystems by tracking energy through trophic levels. The specific efficiency from one level to the next varies enormously depending on the organisms and the environment. But the general constraint remains. Energy becomes less available as it moves upward. This shapes the structure of food webs and sets hard limits on how much biomass can exist at each level. Stability emerges partly from how energy is distributed through these relationships. A simple food chain is brittle. If one link fails, the whole pathway collapses. A food web is more flexible because energy can move through multiple routes. Several predators may share prey. Several prey may rely on the same plants. Decomposition may happen through different microbial pathways. That redundancy can act like a safety net. It allows ecosystem function to continue even when particular species decline. This also helps explain why ecosystems can look calm even when local chaos is unfolding. Individual populations may crash and recover. Species may rise and fall in abundance. Yet overall energy throughput, nutrient cycling, and ecosystem function can remain within workable limits. The system is changing, but not necessarily breaking. It is tempting to imagine ecosystems trying to stay balanced as if they have a goal. They do not. Stability is not intention. It is the result of constraints, feedback, and energy budgets interacting across time. It emerges, and it can vanish when conditions change. Consider a drought. Water becomes limiting. Plants close stomata to reduce water loss, which also limits carbon dioxide intake. Photosynthesis slows. Net primary productivity drops. Less energy enters the ecosystem as new biomass. Herbivores have less to eat. Predators have fewer herbivores to hunt. Decomposer activity can slow if soils become too dry. The forest may still be standing, and from a distance it might still look stable, but internally the energy flow has been squeezed. That squeeze often reduces resilience, making the system more vulnerable to additional disturbances. Now consider fire in a fire-adapted ecosystem. Fire looks like chaos, but in many landscapes it is part of the long-term energy and nutrient dynamics. Fire releases stored carbon and changes nutrient availability. It clears dense vegetation and can allow sunlight to reach the ground, stimulating new growth. In ecosystems shaped by regular fire regimes, stability includes the capacity to pass through fire and remain an ecosystem of the same general type. In that context, stability is not the absence of disturbance. It is the ability to integrate disturbance without losing basic function. This is why stability is never absolute. It is always relative to a disturbance, a timescale, and a specific ecosystem property. A forest may be stable in total biomass but unstable in species composition. A grassland may be stable in productivity but unstable in which plant dominates from year to year. An ocean ecosystem may be stable in overall energy throughput but unstable in the abundance of a particular fish. So when the word stable appears, it helps to ask a few quiet questions. Stable in what sense? Stable against what? Stable over how long? Because ecosystems do not maintain stability for human comfort. They maintain function because life keeps moving energy through itself, and as long as that movement continues, a kind of order can persist, not as stillness, but as dynamic balance. Energy moves through an ecosystem the way water moves through a landscape. It rarely takes only one route. It spreads, splits, recombines, and finds shortcuts. And that simple fact is one of the quiet reasons ecosystems can keep functioning even when parts of them falter. A food chain is a useful story for the human brain because it is tidy, plant to rabbit to fox, algae to zooplankton to fish. It gives the comforting impression that nature is organized like a line at a cafe, with everyone waiting politely for their turn. Real ecosystems are not that polite. In the real world, most organisms are not single-purpose machines. Many herbivores eat more than one kind of plant. Many predators switch prey depending on what is abundant. Many animals are omnivores, moving up and down trophic levels like someone sampling the entire buffet. Even decomposers are diverse, with bacteria, fungi and detritivorers specializing in different kinds of dead material, different chemical bonds, different microhabitats. So the real structure is not a chain, it is a food web. A food web is a network of feeding relationships. And it matters because networks behave differently than lines. A line can be snapped, a network can reroute. If one prey species declines, a predator might shift to another. If one plant suffers a disease outbreak, herbivores may rely more heavily on other plants. If a particular decomposer is limited by temperature or moisture, another group may continue the recycling work in a different way. None of these adjustments are guaranteed, and not all ecosystems have the same flexibility. But the principle is simple. Multiple pathways for energy flow can make an ecosystem less fragile. This is one reason ecologists often care about something that sounds slightly abstract, but turns out to be very practical. Connectivity. Connectivity is about how many links exist between species and how those links are arranged. A highly connected web can distribute impacts, but it can also spread disturbances. A poorly connected web may be less able to compensate when a link disappears. The pattern matters. Not just the number of connections, but where they sit. It helps to picture a coastal kelp forest, where kelp captures energy from sunlight. Sea urchins graze on kelp, and sea otters prey on sea urchins. That is a chain you can write on a napkin. But the real web includes many grazers, many predators, many kinds of algae, many scavengers, many parasites, and microbes, breaking down everything that dies. The energy flow is braided, and braided systems can hold together in ways that single strands cannot. This is also why ecosystems can look stable from a distance, while their internal cast of characters shifts constantly. The overall function, like total productivity or total respiration, can stay within a workable range even if individual populations fluctuate. Stability can come from the system's ability to shuffle energy through different routes without collapsing. But networks have another important feature. In most networks, not every node is equally important. Some nodes are quiet, some are central, some are the difference between a web that holds and a web that unravels. Ecology has a famous term for this: the keystone species. The word keystone comes from architecture. In a stone arch, the keystone is the central stone that locks the rest into place. Remove it, and the structure can fail, even if all the other stones look perfectly solid. In ecology, a keystone species is not necessarily the biggest, the most common, or the most dramatic. It is the species whose influence on the ecosystem is disproportionately large compared with its abundance. One of the classic demonstrations comes from the ecologist Robert Payne in the 1960s. Payne worked in intertidal zones, places where the ocean repeatedly exposes and covers rocky shores, creating a harsh environment where competition and predation are easy to observe. In his famous work with sea stars, Payne removed a predatory sea star from certain areas and watched what happened. The result was not a gentle rearrangement. It was a reorganization of the community. Without the sea star predation pressure, one prey species, often a muscle in these systems, could dominate. That dominance reduced space for other organisms. Diversity dropped. The community became less varied and more monopolized. Payne's work helped show something that still shapes ecology today. Predation is not only about eating. Predation can be a stabilizing force that prevents one competitor from taking over. In that sense, predators can create stability by maintaining diversity and keeping energy and resources distributed across multiple species. Keystone effects are not limited to predators. Some keystone species are ecosystem engineers. organisms that physically modify their environment in ways that support many others. Beavers are a well-known example. By building dams, beavers create wetlands that change water flow, sedimentation, plant communities, insect life, and bird habitat. Their engineering reshapes the entire local ecosystem. Remove the beavers and the landscape can dry out, streams can cut deeper channels, wetland species may decline, and a whole collection of ecological relationships can shift. Other keystone roles can be mutualists, species involved in interactions where both sides benefit, and where the relationship supports a wider community. Pollinators can play keystone roles in some ecosystems because a large number of plant species depend on them for reproduction, and many animals depend on those plants for food or habitat. In some systems, specific pollinators and specific plants are tightly linked, forming relationships that have been shaped over evolutionary time. And then there are keystone predators that change entire landscapes, not only through direct hunting, but through the way their presence alters behavior. The Yellowstone wolf story is often told as a simple, satisfying narrative. Wolves return, elk move less freely, vegetation recovers, and the ecosystem becomes healthier. Reality is more complicated, as ecology usually is, but the broad idea remains important. Wolves are a powerful example of how top predators can influence ecosystems through trophic cascades, where effects ripple from predators to herbivores to plants, and sometimes even to physical processes like erosion and riverbank stability. In Yellowstone National Park, the reintroduction of grey wolves in the 1990s became one of the most closely watched ecological events in modern conservation. Research associated with the National Park Service and many university teams examined how wolf predation and the risk of predation affected elk populations, elk behaviour, and vegetation recovery in some areas. In certain valleys and riparian zones, young willows and aspens showed signs of increased growth compared with earlier periods when browsing pressure was intense. Beavers, which depend on woody vegetation, also became part of the story in some locations, because the availability of suitable plants can affect whether beaver colonies persist. The most useful lesson is not that wolves magically fix everything. The lesson is that ecosystems are shaped by interaction networks, and certain species can hold key positions in those networks. When such a species is removed, the web does not simply lose one strand. The entire pattern of tension changes. This is where stability begins to look less like a feature of individual species and more like a feature of the whole network. And that brings the focus to a question that might seem obvious but has deep consequences. What makes a network stable in the first place? One answer is diversity. Not diversity as a moral slogan, but diversity as a functional property. Diversity can mean many things in ecology. Species richness is the simplest. How many species are present? But functional diversity is often more important for stability. How many different roles exist? How many ways energy can move? How many strategies are available when conditions shift? This is where the insurance idea appears. The insurance hypothesis in ecology suggests that biodiversity provides a kind of buffering capacity. If a system has multiple species performing similar functions, the loss or decline of one species may not cause total functional collapse, because others can partially compensate. This overlap is often called functional redundancy. Redundancy sounds boring. In engineering, it can sound wasteful. In ecology, it can be life-saving. Imagine a grassland where several plant species are capable of fixing carbon efficiently in hot, dry conditions, while others thrive in cooler, wetter periods. If climate variability increases, the system may still maintain productivity across a broader range of conditions because different species perform well at different times. The community as a whole can remain more stable even while its composition shifts. This kind of idea was tested in influential long-term experiments by the ecologist David Tillman and colleagues at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve in Minnesota. Cedar Creek became famous for biodiversity experiments where plots were planted with varying numbers of species, and researchers measured how productivity, nutrient retention, and stability changed across years. A recurring result in these studies is that higher diversity plots often show greater stability in ecosystem function, such as total plant biomass production, especially when conditions vary. One reason is statistical. If species respond differently to weather, pests, or disease, their fluctuations do not line up perfectly. When one declines, another may thrive. The total can remain steadier. Another reason is functional. Different species may access resources differently, such as using water at different soil depths or growing at different times of year, which can increase overall efficiency and reduce vulnerability. It is worth slowing down on a subtle point here because it prevents a common misunderstanding. Biodiversity does not guarantee stability in every sense. An ecosystem can be diverse and still experience dramatic change. A coral reef can have high biodiversity and still be vulnerable to heat stress that disrupts coral symbiosis. A rainforest can be species-rich and still be sensitive to large-scale deforestation or prolonged drought. Diversity is not a shield against physics. But biodiversity often increases the range of conditions over which an ecosystem can continue functioning. It broadens the system's options, and in a world full of variability, options matter. Another useful concept here is response diversity. Response diversity means that even within a group of species that perform a similar role, they may respond differently to disturbance. For example, several pollinator species may all pollinate similar plants, but one may be active in cooler conditions, another in warmer conditions, another may be more resistant to a particular pathogen. If conditions change, the group as a whole may keep delivering the function even if some members struggle. This is one reason why losing a few species can be far more serious than it sounds. If those lost species represent unique functions or unique responses, the system becomes narrower, less flexible, more likely to swing wildly under stress. It is also why keystone species and biodiversity interact in such an interesting way. A keystone species can help maintain biodiversity by preventing competitive domination. Biodiversity can help buffer the system if the keystone species weakens or fluctuates. The architecture of stability is not one pillar, it is an interlocking set of supports. And yet, there is a quiet twist. Stability does not mean nothing changes, and biodiversity does not mean a system is frozen in place. In fact, one of the reasons biodiversity can support stability is because it allows the ecosystem to change without losing overall function. It is the difference between a system that snaps and a system that bends. A forest might maintain stable overall productivity while shifting from one dominant tree species to another over decades. A lake might maintain stable nutrient cycling while its fish community changes in response to temperature and oxygen patterns. A grassland might keep producing biomass, even while the specific mix of grasses and wildflowers rearranges itself year by year. From a distance, the ecosystem seems stable. Up close, it is constantly negotiating. This is also where it helps to remember that food web does not mean only predator and prey. Many stabilizing interactions are not about eating at all. Plants and fungi form mycorrhizal partnerships, where fungi help plants access nutrients and water in exchange for sugars. These networks can influence plant community composition and resilience during drought. Soil microbial communities control decomposition rates and nutrient availability, which can stabilize plant growth across seasons. Even parasites and pathogens can contribute to stability by preventing any one species from growing unchecked. Nature is full of checks and balances that do not look like balance at all, at least not at human timescales. Sometimes stability is produced by things that feel unpleasant, like predation and disease, because those pressures prevent runaway dominance and keep resources circulating through many hands. There is a gentle humour in that, if it is allowed. The ecosystem maintains harmony by constantly arguing with itself. A food web is not a choir singing in unison. It is more like an orchestra warming up, with instruments drifting in and out, tuning, adjusting, occasionally squeaking, yet somehow still producing music that resembles a coherent piece. Now, none of this should be mistaken for a claim that ecosystems are endlessly robust. The architecture can be strong, but it is not unbreakable. A network can absorb a certain amount of loss, and then cross a threshold where redundancy disappears and key roles go unfilled. A predator can be removed, herbivores can surge, and vegetation can shift. A pollinator community can be reduced, and plant reproduction can falter. A microbial community can be altered by pollution, changing decomposition and nutrient cycling. The architecture of stability is real, but it has limits. Even so, understanding this architecture is the beginning of understanding why many ecosystems persist for long periods, despite constant disturbance and constant internal fluctuation. Energy flows through multiple pathways. Networks create alternative routes. Keystone species can hold critical positions. Biodiversity can act as insurance by providing redundancy and response diversity. And together these features help ecosystems stay recognizably themselves, not by resisting all change, but by having enough structure and enough options to keep functioning while change happens anyway. A food web can be rich, redundant, and beautifully connected, and still behave badly if nothing ever reins it in. Networks describe who can eat whom, who competes with whom, and who helps whom. But stability also depends on something more mechanical, almost more thermostat-like. It depends on control systems. The quiet processes that push populations back down when they get too high, or nudge them upward when they fall too low, or sometimes do the opposite and send the system into a spiral. Ecologists often describe these control systems using feedback loops. A feedback loop is a relationship where a change in one part of a system causes effects that eventually influence the original change. It sounds circular, but it is one of the most practical ideas in all of ecology, because it explains why ecosystems do not simply drift endlessly in one direction. A negative feedback loop is the stabilizing kind. It is the kind that resists runaway change. If a population grows, a negative feedback tends to create conditions that slow that growth. If a population shrinks, it may create conditions that help it recover. Negative feedback is one reason ecosystems can wobble without falling over. It does not prevent change, it puts rails around it. A positive feedback loop is the amplifying kind. It takes a change and makes it bigger. If something increases, positive feedback encourages more increase. If something decreases, positive feedback encourages further decrease. Positive feedback is not inherently evil, but it is often the reason a system can tip suddenly instead of drifting gradually. These loops are everywhere once the mind starts looking for them. Take the simple act of eating. If prey becomes abundant, predators often have more food, survive better, reproduce more successfully, and increase in number. As predator numbers rise, predation pressure increases and prey numbers tend to fall. As prey declines, predators have a harder time finding meals, predator survival and reproduction drop, and predator numbers decline as well. With fewer predators, the prey can recover. That is the basic outline of a negative feedback loop between predator and prey. This interplay was captured mathematically in the early 20th century by Alfred Lotka and Vito Volterra, whose work became known as the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model. The important point is not the equation itself, and in calm narration it does not need to be written down. The important point is the mechanism it represents. Mutual regulation through interaction. Predators limit prey, prey limits predators, and together they create oscillations rather than straight lines. In nature, those oscillations are often messy because real food webs have multiple predators, multiple prey, parasites, disease, weather, and habitat complexity all interfering at once. Still, the central idea holds. Population dynamics are not independent, they are entangled. A classic real-world dataset that hints at this comes from records kept by the Hudson Bay Company. tracking fur returns over long periods. The Canada lynx and the snowshoe hare show cycles in those records that have become a well-known teaching example. Hares tend to rise, lynx tend to follow, hares tend to fall, lynx tend to fall after them, and the pattern repeats. In the real world, the cycle is influenced not only by predation, but also by food availability for hares, plant defences, disease, and winter conditions. Even so, the broad feedback loop remains visible across time. It is a reminder that stability is not the same thing as flatness. A system can be stable and still have rhythmic booms and busts. The key is whether those booms and busts remain within bounds that the ecosystem can tolerate without losing its basic structure. Another major stabilizing force is competition for limited resources. If a population grows, individuals compete more intensely for food, water, nesting space, or territory. That competition can reduce birth rates and increase death rates. This is one of the basic reasons populations do not grow forever. It is also a negative feedback loop. Growth creates pressure that slows further growth. This idea is often expressed using the concept of carrying capacity, meaning the maximum population size that an environment can support over time without being degraded. Carrying capacity is not a fixed number carved into stone. It can change with seasons, climate, food quality, predator abundance, disease prevalence, and human impact. But it is still a useful concept because it captures the central truth. Resources are finite, and biology cannot negotiate with arithmetic. The mathematical form that often goes with this idea is the logistic growth model, developed by Pierre-François Verhulst in the 19th century. The logistic model describes growth that starts rapidly when resources are abundant, then slows as competition and limitations increase, eventually approaching a plateau near the carrying capacity. The story is simple. When the population is small, it grows quickly. When it becomes large, the environment pushes back. That pushback, the environment pushing back, is another negative feedback loop, and it can be driven by many mechanisms at once. Food becomes scarce. Predators focus on the abundant prey. Parasites spread more easily in dense populations. Stress increases. Reproduction becomes harder. Survival drops. The system has many ways to discourage endless expansion. In ecology, these processes are often described as density-dependent factors, meaning their effects become stronger as population density increases. Predation can be density-dependent if predators focus on the most common prey. Disease can be density-dependent if transmission increases in crowded conditions. Competition is often density-dependent by its very nature. Density dependence is a major reason populations tend to regulate themselves rather than behaving like runaway trains. Not all limiting factors depend on density, of course. A blizzard does not care how many rabbits there are. A wildfire is not politely waiting for a population to reach a certain threshold. These are density-independent factors, and they can create sudden changes. But even after such events, density-dependent feedback often shapes the recovery. This is where the idea of self-correction becomes visible. An ecosystem does not have a brain, it is not making decisions, but it does contain relationships that create patterned responses. When one component changes, other components respond in predictable ways, because survival and reproduction force them to. If plant biomass increases in a grassland after a wet season, herbivores may increase because more food improves survival and reproduction. If herbivores increase, predators may find hunting easier and also increase. If predators increase, herbivores may be held in check. If herbivores are held in check, plants may persist, and soil may retain more cover, reducing erosion. The result can be a web of linked feedback loops, some stabilizing, some amplifying, all interacting. This is why ecosystems sometimes feel like they have a kind of quiet intelligence. Not because they think, but because the collective outcomes of countless local interactions can look like regulation, like balance, like a thermostat adjusting itself. But thermostats can fail, And ecology has its own ways of failing, often through the same language of feedback loops. Positive feedback is one common route. Consider overgrazing in a dry landscape. If vegetation is reduced, soil becomes more exposed. Exposed soil heats more, loses moisture more quickly, and can erode in wind or rain. With less moisture and poorer soil structure, vegetation regrows more slowly. Slower regrowth means continued exposure, continued drying, continued erosion. The original decline in plants can trigger changes that accelerate further decline. That is positive feedback, and it can push a system into a new state that is harder to reverse. A similar logic can apply in aquatic systems. If nutrients increase in a lake, algae can bloom. Thick algae can reduce light penetration, harming submerged plants that stabilize sediments. With fewer plants, sediments can be stirred up more easily, making the water murkier, further reducing light, further harming plants. In some lakes, this contributes to a regime shift from a clear water, plant-dominated state to a turbid, algae-dominated state. The details vary, but the feedback logic is a common theme. The key is that ecosystems are not guaranteed to return to a previous condition just because the original disturbance ends. If feedback loops have altered the system's structure, the system may settle into a different basin of stability, a different set of self-reinforcing processes. Even when feedback remains stabilizing, regulation is rarely gentle on the level of individual lives. Populations may be held near carrying capacity through starvation, increased predation, or disease. Predators may be regulated by a lack of prey. Competition may be regulated by exclusion, territory loss, or reduced reproduction. The ecosystem can remain stable in function while individual organisms experience constant pressure. There's a slightly dark humour there if it is used sparingly. Nature often maintains balance the way a crowded elevator maintains balance, not by being comfortable, but by having firm limits and very little personal space. Still, the outcome is remarkable. In many systems, despite storms, seasonal stress, and constant biological conflict, population sizes often hover within ranges that keep the ecosystem recognizable. The forest remains a forest. The grassland remains a grassland. The lake remains a lake. And a large part of that persistence comes from the fact that ecosystems are packed with regulatory relationships that oppose runaway change. Yet regulation can also create cycles that feel dramatic. Predator-prey oscillations can be large. Plant seed production can vary wildly across years in massed events, where trees produce heavy seed crops in some years and very little in others. Those pulses can flood the system with food, boosting rodents, boosting predators, and shifting disease dynamics. Stability does not forbid pulses. It shapes how the system responds to pulses. At this point, the idea of stability begins to feel less like a single property and more like a dance between structure and control. Structure provides the pathways for energy and interaction. Control systems, through feedback loops and density dependence, keep those pathways from being overwhelmed by growth, scarcity, or collapse. And if there is one calm, practical takeaway here, it is that ecological stability is not something that sits on top of nature like a protective glass dome. It is something generated continuously by the push and pull of living relationships, predators and prey, competition and cooperation, abundance and limitation, growth and constraint. The ecosystem does not hold still. It corrects itself, sometimes smoothly, sometimes roughly, sometimes not fast enough. And when those corrections begin to fail, the difference can often be seen first in the feedback loops, the places where a stabilizing response becomes an amplifying one, and where the system shifts from quietly self-regulating to quietly slipping out of its old boundaries. An ecosystem can be stable and still be interrupted. In fact, many ecosystems only make sense when interruption is treated as normal. Wind throws trees, floods rearrange riverbanks, frost snaps stems, lightning lights the dry season like a match. Even a calm year contains smaller disturbances, A pest outbreak in one valley, a disease wave through one population, a local landslide that resets a hillside. Nature is not a museum exhibit that is occasionally damaged. It is a working system that is constantly being nudged, scraped and reshaped. In ecology, a disturbance is any event that disrupts ecosystem structure and changes the availability of resources, the physical environment, or the relationships between organisms. Disturbance can remove biomass, open space, alter light levels, change soil chemistry, or shift who can survive in a particular place. Disturbance can be sudden, like a storm, or slow, like a multi-year drought that gradually weakens trees until insects finish the job. Disturbance can be small, like a single tree falling, or large, like a fire that travels for days. It is tempting to hear the word disturbance and imagine disaster, as though stability means avoiding disturbance altogether. But that is not how most ecosystems are built. Many are structured around recurrent disruption, so much so that removing disturbance can make them less stable rather than more stable. Fire is a good example because it feels like the opposite of calm. Yet many landscapes depend on fire regimes, meaning patterns of fire frequency, intensity, seasonality, and spatial spread. In some pine forests, regular low-intensity burns clear understory plants and leaf litter, reducing fuel buildup and allowing fire-adapted species to regenerate. In certain savannas, fire helps maintain open grass-dominated systems by preventing woody plants from closing the canopy. In those ecosystems, fire is not a rare failure, it is part of the operating system. Research and management work from organizations such as the United States Forest Service has long emphasized this, especially in places where fire suppression policies changed forest structure over decades. When low-intensity fires are excluded for long periods, fuels can accumulate, forest density can increase, and when fire eventually occurs, it may burn hotter and more destructively than the historical pattern. In a strange way, preventing disturbance can set the stage for a more severe disturbance later. Storms do similar work in different ways. A hurricane can strip leaves, snap branches and topple trees, creating patches of open light in a forest. Those gaps are not just damage. They are opportunities. Light reaches the ground, seedlings that have been waiting in shade can surge, and the composition of the forest can shift. In coastal systems, storms can reshape dunes, redistribute sand, and alter salinity patterns in estuaries. On rocky shores, large waves can remove mussel beds or seaweed patches, resetting the competition for space. Floods can be equally creative. River floods deposit nutrient-rich sediments on floodplains, supporting productive forests and wetlands. They also scour channels, shift gravel bars, and rearrange habitats. If a river never floods, its floodplain ecology changes. If it floods too often or too intensely, different species dominate. The pattern, again, matters. This is why ecologists often talk about disturbance regimes rather than disturbance as a single event. A disturbance regime is the long-term pattern that a community has evolved with and adapted to. When the disturbance regime changes, stability can change with it. There is a well-known ecological idea that sits right in the middle of this, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, often associated with the ecologist Joseph Connell. The basic claim is that species diversity may be highest at intermediate levels of disturbance. If disturbance is extremely rare, strong competitors can dominate, gradually excluding other species. If disturbance is extremely frequent or severe, only a small set of tough, fast-recovering species can persist. But when disturbance occurs often enough to prevent monopoly, yet not so often that it wipes everything out, a broader range of species can coexist. It is not a law of nature that applies cleanly everywhere, and ecologists debate its generality and how best to test it. Still, it captures an intuitive mechanism. Disturbance can prevent the ecosystem from getting stuck in a single, rigid arrangement. In that sense, disturbance can support stability by preserving diversity and keeping multiple functional strategies in play. This is the quieter truth behind many stable landscapes. They are not stable because nothing ever happens. They are stable because things happen in patterns the system can absorb. Stability is compatible with disruption when the system has evolved with that disruption, and when the web of relationships is built to reorganize afterward. But once disturbance happens, something begins immediately, even if it looks like nothing but ash, bare ground, or broken trees. Recovery. Recovery is not a single process. It is a sequence of changes in community composition and ecosystem structure over time. Ecology has a name for this unfolding pattern: ecological succession. Succession is the way ecosystems assemble and reassemble. It is how life fills in gaps. It is how a disturbed patch becomes a young community, and how a young community becomes something more complex, more layered, and often more stable in certain respects. Ecologists usually distinguish between primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession begins where there is no soil or biological legacy left behind, such as new volcanic rock, freshly exposed glacial ground, or bare sand where nothing has been growing. Secondary succession begins where the disturbance removed organisms, but left behind soil, seeds, roots, microbes, and nutrients. After a wildfire that burns vegetation but leaves soil intact, recovery is usually secondary succession. After a lava flow that cools into bare rock, recovery is closer to primary succession. One of the reasons secondary succession can be fast, sometimes surprisingly fast, is that the ecosystem is not starting from zero. Seeds can remain viable in soil seed banks. Roots can resprout. Fungi and bacteria can persist underground. Nutrients may still be present even if redistributed. In many ecosystems, the living memory is stored below the surface. Early successional communities often have a particular feel. They tend to be dominated by pioneer species, organisms that are good at colonizing open space. Pioneer plants often grow quickly, produce many seeds, tolerate harsh conditions, and take advantage of abundant light and reduced competition. In a forest gap, this might mean fast-growing shrubs and young trees that are adapted to sunlight. In a grassland, it might mean opportunistic annual plants and rapidly spreading grasses. In a barren landscape, it may begin with lichens and microbes that can survive on rock and gradually contribute to soil formation. As pioneers establish, they change the environment. They add organic matter to the soil. They shade the ground. They alter moisture retention. They influence nutrient availability. And those changes can make the site more suitable for other species that were previously unable to thrive there. Succession is partly a story of organisms modifying conditions in ways that invite new arrivals. This idea was central to the classic view of succession developed by Frederick Clements, who described succession as a somewhat predictable, directional process leading toward a more mature community. Clements imagined communities moving towards something like a stable endpoint under a given climate, often referred to historically as a climax community. In that view, succession is like development, with stages that tend to follow one another in a recognizable order. But ecology also developed a different, equally influential perspective. Henry Gleason argued that communities are not single superorganisms marching toward one inevitable endpoint. Instead, he emphasized the individualistic concept of plant associations, where each species responds to environmental gradients in its own way, and community composition is shaped by chance, dispersal, and local conditions as much as by a fixed script. Modern ecology tends to take a more blended view. Succession often shows patterns and regularities because species traits and environmental constraints do shape which organisms can establish when. But contingency matters. A different sequence of storms, a different seed source nearby, a different soil moisture pattern, or a different herbivore pressure can steer the same disturbed site toward a different community, even under the same climate. And that brings stability back into the picture. Because stability is not only about returning to the past, it is often about reorganizing into a functional arrangement that fits current conditions. A dramatic, well-studied example of disturbance followed by succession comes from Mount St. Helens in Washington state. In 1980, the volcanic eruption removed forests, buried habitats, and reworked entire landscapes. Some areas were blasted to bare ground. Others were covered in ash and debris. The scale was enormous, yet recovery began in more than one way. Research associated with the United States Geological Survey and many university teams documented how plants, insects, and animals recolonized. In some places, pockets of surviving organisms acted as refuges, seeding recovery outward. In other places, wind-dispersed seeds arrived first. In still other areas, the first visible pioneers were not plants at all, but microbes and nitrogen-fixing species that helped build fertility. The lesson from Mount St. Helens is that succession can be both resilient and surprising. Recovery does not require a perfect reset, it requires pathways. Succession is also tied to energy flow and nutrient cycling in very practical ways. Early successional systems often have high light availability and rapid growth. They may show high net primary productivity for a period as plants rapidly accumulate biomass. Over time, as the canopy closes in forests, light becomes limiting in the understory. Biomass may continue to accumulate, but the distribution of energy changes. Decomposition becomes a larger part of the system's ongoing metabolism. Nutrient cycling can tighten, with more nutrients retained within living tissue and soil organic matter, rather than being lost. This is one reason mature forests can feel stable. They often have complex structure, stored carbon, layered habitats, and established nutrient cycles. But maturity does not mean invulnerability. A mature forest may be less resistant to certain disturbances, such as severe drought combined with heat stress, than a younger forest dominated by fast-growing, stress-tolerant species. Stability depends on the disturbance type, the time scale, and the ecological context. It also helps to recognize that not all recovery is a return. Sometimes succession after disturbance leads to a different stable state. If climate shifts, if invasive species establish, if soils erode, if herbivore pressure changes, or if a disturbance becomes more frequent, the community that forms afterward may not resemble what came before. The system can still be stable in the sense of maintaining function, but it may be stable in a new configuration. This is especially obvious in places where disturbance regimes are changing rapidly. If fires become more frequent than the time required for certain tree species to reach reproductive maturity, forests can shift toward shrublands or grasslands. If warming waters trigger repeated coral bleaching events, coral-dominated reefs can shift toward algae-dominated systems. These are not merely temporary setbacks. They can be long-term reorganizations driven by changed conditions and feedback loops. So, disturbance and succession together reveal a subtle kind of stability. Ecosystems are often stable not because they avoid disturbance, but because they have ways to pass through it. Recovery is not a bonus feature. It is part of how ecosystems exist in a variable world. Even the word recovery can be gently misleading because it suggests a return to exactly what was there before. In ecology, the more accurate idea is reassembly. Life returns, but it returns by negotiating with the new conditions left behind. The burned patch has different light and nutrients. The storm gap has different moisture and wind exposure. The floodplain has different sediments. The volcanic slope has different soil, if it has soil at all. And yet, again and again, the same broad pattern appears. Empty space is temporary. Open niches are filled. Networks rebuild. Energy pathways reform. The ecosystem becomes a working system again, not because it was designed to be stable, but because organisms are relentlessly adapted to exploit opportunities and survive constraints. There is something quietly comforting in that, even when the disturbances themselves are not comforting. A disturbed ecosystem is not a broken ecosystem. It is an ecosystem in motion, reorganizing, assembling, and testing new arrangements. Stability, in the end, is often the ability to keep rebuilding without losing the capacity to function. And succession is one of the clearest ways to watch that rebuilding happen, step by step, as the living world turns disruption into another form of continuity. Stability becomes easier to appreciate once disturbance is treated as ordinary. Fires happen, storms happen, droughts happen, and ecosystems often recover, not by returning to a perfect photograph of the past, but by rebuilding a working version of themselves. That ability to keep functioning through change is the heart of a modern ecological idea that is both practical and slightly philosophical: resilience. In everyday language, resilience can mean toughness, stubbornness, or sheer determination. In ecology, resilience has a more precise meaning. It is about the capacity of an ecosystem to absorb disturbance, reorganize, and still retain its core identity. Identity here means the basic structure of the system and the key processes that make it an ecosystem rather than just a pile of organisms. Primary production continues. Decomposition continues. Nutrients cycle. Food webs still channel energy. The system remains recognizable as a forest, a grassland, a wetland, a coral reef, or whatever it is meant to be under the conditions it faces. This framing was sharpened by the ecologist Crawford Stanley Holling in the 1970s, when he challenged the older idea that stability meant small fluctuations around a single equilibrium. Holling argued that ecosystems can have multiple possible stable states, and that the ability to stay within a desirable state depends on how much disturbance the system can absorb without crossing a boundary. In his view, resilience is less about resisting change and more about surviving change without transforming into something fundamentally different. A useful way to imagine this is to think of an ecosystem as a set of interacting processes that can flex within limits. A resilient system can bend. It can shift species abundances, alter behavior, and reroute energy pathways while still keeping the overall machine running. A less resilient system may appear stable until it suddenly breaks, because it was stable only within a narrow set of conditions. So, resilience is not the same as resistance. Resistance is about how little a system changes when pushed. Resilience is about whether the system can change and still remain itself. A system can be highly resistant and not very resilient, like a rigid structure that holds firm until it snaps. Another system can be less resistant but highly resilient, like something that sways in the wind and survives because it moves. This is where the idea of adaptive capacity becomes important. Adaptive capacity is the ability of a system to adjust to change in ways that preserve function. Some of that capacity comes from biodiversity because diverse systems have more options. Some comes from ecosystem structure, such as complex food webs with alternative pathways. Some comes from the physical environment, such as soils that hold moisture, wetlands that buffer floods, or reefs that reduce wave energy. And some comes from traits of the organisms themselves, including physiological tolerance, dispersal ability, and reproductive strategies. Adaptive capacity is not only about evolution over thousands of years, although evolution matters. It can also be about ecological flexibility on shorter timescales. Predators switching prey, plants shifting growth timing, microbial communities changing their composition, species moving to different microhabitats. Ecosystems have many ways of adjusting without rewriting their entire identity. This is one reason ecologists sometimes talk about ecological memory. Memory sounds like something that belongs in a brain, but here it means something more grounded. It refers to the biological legacies that remain after disturbance and help guide recovery. seed banks in soil, roots capable of resprouting, surviving organisms in refuges, stored nutrients, persistent microbial communities. Even the physical structure of the landscape can act as memory, such as hollows that hold water longer, or sheltered slopes that protect certain species during extreme events. When ecological memory is strong, recovery can be faster and more reliable. When it is weakened, resilience can fade. Another modern idea that connects directly to resilience is the adaptive cycle, often discussed by Holling and later expanded by researchers linked to the Resilience Alliance. The adaptive cycle describes how ecosystems and other complex systems often move through phases of rapid growth, accumulation of resources and structure, increasing rigidity, then release during disturbance, followed by reorganization. The details vary, and nature is not obligated to follow a neat loop, but the general pattern is observed in many systems. A young forest grows quickly. A mature forest accumulates biomass and complexity. Over time, it can become more rigid and fuel-loaded. A fire releases stored energy and rearranges structure. Then the system reorganizes and begins again. This view makes resilience feel less like a static property and more like a dynamic balancing act. It depends on how resources are stored, how tightly the system is connected, and how quickly it can reorganize after disruption. And now comes the unsettling part. Resilience has limits. Ecosystems can absorb only so much disturbance before the basic architecture changes. When that happens, the system may cross what ecologists call a threshold and shift into a different regime. This is where the language changes from resilience to tipping points, and from recovery to regime shifts. A tipping point in ecology is a critical threshold at which a small additional change can produce a large and often rapid transformation in ecosystem state. The system does not merely adjust, it reorganizes into a new stable configuration with different dominant species, different feedback loops, and sometimes different ecosystem services, meaning the benefits humans and other organisms receive from ecosystem function. One reason tipping points matter is that they often involve hysteresis, meaning the path back is not simply the reverse of the path forward. Once an ecosystem has shifted regimes, returning to the old conditions may not be enough to restore the old state. Additional interventions or much larger changes might be needed if recovery is possible at all. The ecosystem becomes stable again, but stable in a new way. The ecologist Martin Scheffer has been a central figure in bringing attention to critical transitions in ecosystems, including lakes, coral reefs, and other systems where regime shifts have been observed. Scheffer and colleagues have helped clarify how feedback loops can lock a system into one state or another, and how early warning signals might sometimes be detected before a tipping point is crossed. A classic example comes from shallow lakes. Many shallow lakes can exist in a clear water state, where aquatic plants grow, sediments are relatively stable, and water clarity remains high. But if nutrient inputs, especially phosphorus and nitrogen from agriculture or sewage, increase beyond a certain point, algae can bloom. Thick algae reduce light penetration, harming submerged plants. With fewer plants, sediments can be stirred up more easily, which makes water more turbid. Turbidity further reduces light, which further reduces plants. This creates a self-reinforcing feedback loop that favors an algae-dominated turbid state. Once the lake has flipped, reducing nutrient input back to the old level may not be enough to restore the clear water state quickly, because the feedback loops in the turbid state keep it stable. Sometimes active restoration is needed, such as reducing internal nutrient loading, managing fish populations that stir sediments, or physically removing algae and nutrients. The lake is stable again, but in a different regime. Coral reefs provide another stark example. Coral reefs rely on the health of corals, which are animals living in close symbiosis with photosynthetic algae called zooxanthellae. When water temperatures rise beyond what corals can tolerate, corals can expel these symbiotic algae, leading to coral bleaching. Bleached corals are not necessarily dead immediately, but they are stressed and can die if heat stress persists. If bleaching events become frequent, corals may not recover between them. When coral cover declines, algae can take over, especially if herbivorous fish that normally graze algae are reduced by overfishing. This can create another feedback trap. Less coral means less complex habitat for reef fish. Fewer fish can mean less grazing. Less grazing allows more algae. More algae can inhibit coral larval settlement and recovery. The system can shift from coral-dominated to algae-dominated. Again, the reef may remain stable in a sense. It can still be a functioning ecosystem with energy flow and nutrient cycling. But it is a different ecosystem, with different species, different structure, and different services. On land, regime shifts can occur in dry lands, where vegetation loss can lead to soil erosion, reduced water infiltration, and further vegetation loss. In some cases, grasslands can shift toward shrublands, or productive landscapes can shift toward degraded states, with patchy plant cover and persistent dust and runoff problems. These shifts can be driven by grazing pressure, drought frequency, and land management, all interacting with feedback loops tied to soil stability and water retention. The important point is that ecosystems can be stable right up until they are not. A system can appear to be managing disturbance, wobbling but recovering, until it crosses a threshold where the feedback structure changes. This brings up a question that scientists and managers care about deeply. Can tipping points be predicted? Sometimes there are early warning signals. One proposed signal is critical slowing down, where a system takes longer to recover from small disturbances as it approaches a tipping point. Imagine nudging the system slightly and watching it return to normal. If that return becomes slower over time, it can indicate the system is losing resilience. Another signal can be increasing variability, where the system becomes more erratic and less tightly bounded. Changes in spatial patterns, such as vegetation becoming patchier in drylands, have also been studied as possible warnings. These ideas are active research areas, and they do not provide guaranteed forecasts. Ecosystems are noisy, and real environments contain many overlapping drivers. But the central message remains clear: resilience is not infinite, and tipping points are often about feedback loops shifting from stabilizing to amplifying. This is the bend versus break distinction in its most ecological form. A resilient ecosystem bends by adjusting its internal composition and interactions while preserving function. A system near a tipping point may still look fine on the surface, but it is beginning to lose the capacity to absorb additional stress. It is like a bridge that still carries traffic, but has lost some of its structural safety margin. The next heavy load might be fine, or it might be the one that exposes the weakness. None of this means ecosystems are always teetering on the edge. Many are not. Many have wide resilience margins. But the concept is essential because it explains why ecological change is not always gradual. It can be sudden, non-linear, and difficult to reverse. And there is a practical calmness in naming this honestly. Resilience is not a feel-good slogan. It is a scientific concept grounded in feedback loops, thresholds, and system dynamics. It helps explain why some ecosystems recover again and again, and why others reorganize into something new after what looks like one disturbance too many. Stability, in this modern view, is not only the ability to stay the same, it is the ability to keep functioning, and the boundary between functioning and transforming is often drawn by thresholds that are invisible until they are crossed. When looking closely at food webs, feedback loops, disturbance, and recovery, it can start to feel as though stability is something an ecosystem generates from within, like a clever internal balancing act. And that is partly true. Interactions matter. Diversity matters. The structure of the network matters. But ecosystems do not get to choose the stage they perform on. The stage is climate, and the stage lighting is sunlight, temperature, and water. Climate is the broad external forcing that sets the boundaries of what an ecosystem can be in the first place. It controls how much energy arrives as usable growing conditions, how long the growing season lasts, how quickly water evaporates, and whether living tissue spends more time building itself or simply trying not to dry out, freeze, or overheat. Even the most intricately connected food web cannot keep a rainforest functioning if rainfall collapses for decades, and even the most resilient tundra community cannot behave like a tropical forest just because it feels motivated. In ecology, this is why the idea of a biome exists. A biome is a large-scale ecological category shaped mainly by climate, especially temperature and precipitation patterns, and secondarily by soils and disturbance regimes. Tropical rainforests cluster where warmth and rainfall are high. Deserts dominate where precipitation is low, and evaporation wins most arguments. Boreal forests appear where winters are long and cold and growth is slow but steady in the short summer. Grasslands thrive where seasonal drought and grazing or fire prevent continuous forest canopy. None of this is a perfect map, because mountains, coastlines, ocean currents, and local weather patterns complicate everything. But it captures the underlying truth. Climate sets the menu. Ecology chooses from it. A practical way to think about climate as a stabilizer is to imagine it as the long-term range of conditions an ecosystem has adapted to. If temperature and rainfall stay within that familiar envelope, the ecosystem's internal mechanisms, including feedback loops and resilience, usually have a fighting chance. If climate shifts outside that envelope, the ecosystem may be forced to reorganize. It might still be stable, but stable in a different state. This is why climate change matters to stability in a very specific way. It does not merely add stress, it changes baselines, it shifts the frequency and intensity of disturbances, it alters the timing of seasons, it pushes conditions toward thresholds that ecosystems did not necessarily evolve to handle at the current speed. Scientific bodies such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, often called the IPCC, summarize evidence that warming temperatures are changing heat extremes, precipitation patterns, drought risk, wildfire conditions, and marine heat waves. These are not abstract trends. They are the external pressures that determine whether an ecosystem is playing on familiar ground or on a moving floor. NASA Earth Science Research, along with many international monitoring programs, uses satellites to observe large-scale patterns that connect climate and ecosystems. Vegetation greenness, changes in land cover, wildfire scars, ocean surface temperature, and even atmospheric carbon dioxide can be tracked as a kind of planetary pulse. From this perspective, ecosystems are not isolated patches. They are linked to the atmosphere and oceans through constant exchange. One of the most important exchanges is the carbon cycle. Carbon moves between the atmosphere, the ocean, living biomass, and soils. Plants pull carbon dioxide from the air during photosynthesis and store it in wood, leaves, roots, and soil organic matter. Microbes and animals return carbon dioxide through respiration and decomposition. Oceans absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but warming water holds less gas, and changes in circulation can alter how much carbon is stored at depth. On long timescales, carbon also moves through rocks via weathering and sedimentation, but for ecosystem stability on human timescales, the living and oceanic parts are especially relevant. A forest can act as a carbon sink when it is growing and accumulating biomass, pulling carbon from the atmosphere. That sink can weaken or reverse when drought, fire, insect outbreaks, or deforestation reduce biomass and increase decomposition and burning. This creates a climate ecosystem feedback loop that can be stabilizing or destabilizing. When ecosystems store carbon, they reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide growth and slightly dampen warming. When ecosystems lose carbon, they add to atmospheric carbon dioxide and potentially amplify warming. Stability, again, is not just local. it can feed back into the wider Earth system. Climate also governs productivity through water and temperature constraints. Primary production is not only about sunlight, it is about whether plants can keep stomata open without losing too much water, whether enzymes work efficiently at prevailing temperatures, and whether soil moisture allows roots to access nutrients. A warming trend can increase productivity in some cold, limited regions for a time, but it can reduce productivity in already warm regions by pushing temperatures past optimal ranges and increasing water stress. In oceans, climate shapes productivity through stratification and nutrient supply. When surface waters warm, they can become more stratified, meaning mixing between surface and deeper layers becomes weaker. That mixing is important because deep water often contains nutrients that surface phytoplankton need. If fewer nutrients reach the surface, primary production can decline in some regions, even if sunlight remains abundant. Here, climate forcing works indirectly, altering the physical structure that supports the base of the food web. But climate is only one side of the scaling up story. It sets conditions from the outside. The other side is internal to the ecosystem, and it is just as fundamental. Nutrient cycling. If energy is the current that flows through ecosystems, nutrients are the building materials carried along with it. Life can have plenty of sunlight, and still struggle if key nutrients are missing, because living tissue is built from atoms that cannot be conjured out of empty space. Carbon is the backbone, but nitrogen is essential for proteins and chlorophyll. Phosphorus is central for genetic material and energy transfer molecules, and many other elements, including potassium, iron and trace metals, can limit growth in specific contexts. In ecology, this is the core of biogeochemistry, the study of how chemical elements cycle through living systems and the physical environment. Nutrient cycling is one of the reasons ecosystems can remain productive and stable over long periods instead of burning through their resources like a careless campfire. The carbon cycle is often discussed because it connects so directly to climate, but nitrogen and phosphorus cycles are equally important for ecosystem function. Nitrogen is abundant in the atmosphere, but most organisms cannot use atmospheric nitrogen directly. Nitrogen must be converted into usable forms through nitrogen fixation, a process carried out by certain bacteria and archaea. Some of these microbes live freely in soils or waters, and some live in symbiosis with plants, such as legumes in structures called root nodules. Once nitrogen is in the system, it moves through food webs. Plants incorporate it into tissues. Herbivores eat plants. Predators eat herbivores. Decomposers break down dead material and waste, releasing nitrogen back into soil as ammonium. Other microbes convert ammonium to nitrate through nitrification. Still others return nitrogen to the atmosphere through denitrification, completing the cycle. Phosphorus is different. It does not have a large atmospheric reservoir in the same way. Its cycle is more tied to rocks, soils, and water. Weathering of phosphate-bearing rocks releases phosphorus into soils and waterways. Plants take it up. Animals consume it. Decomposers return it. Some phosphorus is lost from ecosystems through runoff into rivers and oceans, where it may end up buried in sediments. These cycles are not only about keeping ecosystems fed, they also influence stability and thresholds. When nutrient cycling is tight and efficient, nutrients are retained within the system, supporting consistent productivity. When nutrient cycling becomes leaky, nutrients are lost, productivity can drop, and community composition can shift towards species that tolerate low fertility. This is one reason soils matter so much. Soil is not merely dirt, it is a living, chemically active system. It stores nutrients, holds water, buffers pH, and provides habitat for a vast community of microbes, fungi, and small animals that drive decomposition and nutrient transformations. The stability of many terrestrial ecosystems depends heavily on soil structure and soil organic matter, which can take decades or centuries to build and can be lost rapidly through erosion or mismanagement. In the ocean, nutrient cycling also shapes stability. but it is expressed through mixing, upwelling, and microbial processing. Regions of upwelling, such as parts of the Eastern Pacific, bring nutrient-rich deep water to the surface, supporting high phytoplankton productivity and rich fisheries. That productivity supports complex food webs, from zooplankton to fish to seabirds and marine mammals. If climate patterns shift ocean circulation, these productive zones can shift as well, with consequences cascading through entire marine ecosystems. Research institutions such as the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution have contributed heavily to understanding these ocean cycles, including how nutrients, carbon, and microbial communities interact with physical ocean processes. The ocean is a reminder that nutrient cycling is not always a local loop. It can be regional, even global, because water masses move and carry chemistry with them. Nutrients can also push ecosystems toward thresholds when they arrive in excess. This is where the stabilizer becomes a destabilizer, not because nutrients are bad, but because ecosystems evolved under certain nutrient regimes. When humans add large quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus through fertilizers, sewage, and industrial emissions, ecosystems can respond with dramatic changes. In lakes and coastal waters, excess nutrients can fuel algal blooms. When those blooms die and decompose, microbes consume oxygen, creating low oxygen zones that stress or kill fish and invertebrates. In some systems, repeated nutrient loading can contribute to regime shifts, where clear water states flip to turbid states dominated by algae. The mechanism is not mysterious. It is nutrient supply altering primary production, decomposition, oxygen dynamics, and feedback loops. On land, nitrogen deposition from the atmosphere can fertilize some ecosystems, increasing growth for a time, but it can also acidify soils and alter plant communities. Some plants are adapted to low nitrogen environments and are outcompeted when nitrogen becomes abundant. This can reduce biodiversity and change ecosystem function. The system may still be productive, but it becomes different, with altered stability properties. So climate and nutrient cycling work together as the broad external and internal governors of ecosystem stability. Climate sets the overall conditions: temperature, water availability, seasonality, disturbance regimes. Nutrient cycling determines whether organisms can build biomass, how efficiently resources are reused, and whether productivity is sustained or constrained. When both are within familiar bounds, ecosystems often have room to bend, reorganize, and recover. When either shifts rapidly or crosses a threshold, the risk of regime change grows. There is a calm kind of clarity in this. Ecosystems are not held stable by wishful thinking or by a vague notion of balance. They are held in workable states by physical constraints and chemical budgets, by sunlight and water, by nitrogen and phosphorus, by the slow work of microbes and the long reach of climate. Stability, at its largest scale, is a conversation between the biosphere and the planet that contains it. The atmosphere sets the conditions. The oceans redistribute heat and nutrients. Life responds, and in responding, life changes the atmosphere and oceans in return. It is not always a soothing conversation, but it is continuous, and it is one of the deepest reasons the Earth feels alive rather than inert. And when those planetary conditions shift, ecosystems do what they have always done. They adjust, they reorganize, and they try to keep functioning. Sometimes they succeed by bending. Sometimes the chemistry and physics insist on a break, and a new arrangement takes hold. An ecosystem can look simple from far away. A forest is just trees. A reef is just coral. A grassland is just grass. But that is only what the landscape looks like when the mind squints. Up close, an ecosystem is a complex system, and complex does not mean complicated in a messy, discouraging way. It means the system is made of many parts that interact, and the interactions create outcomes that cannot be predicted by looking at any single part in isolation. Complex systems show patterns that emerge, No single ant designs an ant colony, yet the colony builds nests, finds food, and adjusts to threats. No single fish plans a schooling pattern, yet the school moves like a single fluid body. In ecosystems, no species is in charge, and still the system often settles into a recognizable structure with repeating flows of energy and cycling of nutrients. This is what ecologists mean by emergence. Emergence is when the whole does something that the parts cannot do alone. A single tree cannot create a forest microclimate, but a forest can. A single coral polyp cannot shape a reef's wave protection, but a reef can. A single bacterium cannot create soil fertility, but microbial communities can. Complex systems also tend to be non-linear. Non-linear simply means inputs and outputs do not scale in a neat, proportional way. A small change might do almost nothing for years, then trigger a big shift. Or a large change might be absorbed with surprisingly little visible effect. This is why ecosystems can feel calm, right up until the moment they are not. A helpful way to picture this is with networks, because ecosystems are networks at almost every level. Food webs are networks. Pollination relationships form networks. Mycorrhizal fungi and plant roots create networks in soil. Rivers create networks of water and nutrient movement across landscapes. Even the spread of wildfire behaves like a network process, where connectivity of fuels and weather conditions determines how quickly disturbances propagate. Networks have structure. Some are loosely connected, some are tightly connected, some have clusters, some have hubs. A hub is a node with unusually many connections. In ecological terms, a hub might be a highly connected plant species that supports many herbivores, which in turn support many predators. Or it might be a habitat patch that connects multiple wildlife corridors. Or it might be a keystone predator that influences several prey species. This is where stability can become a network property rather than a species property. In many networks, removing a random node does little. Removing a hub can have outsized consequences. The ecosystem might keep functioning after a few losses, then suddenly struggle when a critical connector disappears. Researchers at the Santa Fe Institute and other complexity science groups have explored how complex systems can be robust and fragile at the same time. Robust in the sense that they can tolerate many small shocks. Fragile in the sense that certain kinds of shocks aimed at certain parts of the network can cause disproportionate change. This dual nature is not a flaw. It is a common feature of systems built from many interacting parts. Complex systems are also full of feedback loops. Some feedback loops stabilize, some amplify, and in a complex network, feedback loops can overlap, interfere, and occasionally team up to surprise everyone. A lake can be regulated by stabilizing predator-prey dynamics among fish and plankton, while also being pushed toward instability by nutrient loading and oxygen feedback. A forest can be buffered by biodiversity and soil water storage, while also being destabilized by heat stress and insect outbreaks. The system is not one mechanism. It is a tapestry of mechanisms, and the overall stability depends on how those mechanisms combine under real conditions. This is why ecological prediction is so difficult, and also why it is so interesting. Ecosystems are not random. They have rules. The rules are just distributed across thousands of interactions, and the rules can change when conditions change. And now comes the part that can be stated plainly without turning it into a lecture. Humans are part of ecosystems, but humans also alter ecosystems in ways that are unusually fast, unusually large in scale, and unusually good at reshaping the network itself. In other words, the disturbance regime has acquired a new personality. Human impacts often work by changing connectivity, energy flow, nutrient budgets, and feedback loops all at once. The ecosystem might still look familiar on the surface, but the internal structure can become less resilient, less redundant, and more prone to threshold shifts. One of the clearest examples is habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. Habitat loss is straightforward. Forest becomes farmland, wetland becomes housing, grassland becomes roads and industrial sites. Less habitat usually means fewer individuals, fewer species, and fewer options for recovery after disturbance. Fragmentation is more subtle. Fragmentation is when habitat remains, but it is broken into isolated patches. Imagine a continuous forest turned into a set of forest islands separated by fields, highways, and cities. The total area might still look substantial, but the connectivity has changed. Movement becomes harder. Gene flow between populations declines. Local extinctions become more likely, because recolonization from neighbouring patches is less reliable. Fragmentation also creates edge effects. The edges of habitat patches have different conditions than the interior. More light, more wind, different humidity, more disturbance from human activity, and often more invasive species pressure. A patch can be mostly edge. That can change plant communities, predator-prey interactions, and microclimate, sometimes enough to alter the entire internal balance. Then there is over-exploitation, meaning harvesting organisms faster than they can replace themselves. Fishing, hunting, logging, and wildlife trade can all remove key species from food webs. The stability issue here is not only the loss of individuals, it is the loss of roles. Remove a top predator, and herbivores may increase. Changing vegetation, remove a dominant grazer, and algae or plants may accumulate differently. Remove long-lived seed dispersers, and forests may regenerate in altered patterns. The ecosystem continues, but it reorganizes around the missing pieces. There is a quiet irony in how often ecosystems tolerate a lot of general stress, but respond sharply to the removal of a particular role. It is like a company where many employees can be absent and the office still functions, but the one person who knows the password to the printer disappears, and suddenly civilization ends. Pollution is another major driver, and it comes in many forms. Chemical pollutants can disrupt reproduction, growth, and immune function in wildlife. Nutrient pollution, especially nitrogen and phosphorus from agriculture and sewage, can cause eutrophication in lakes and coastal waters, fueling algal blooms and oxygen depletion. Plastic pollution can alter marine food webs through ingestion and entanglement. Air pollution can change plant physiology and soil chemistry. The common theme is that pollution alters the chemical environment that organisms evolved within, often in ways that shift feedback loops and push systems toward new states. Invasive species can act like ecological rewriters. An invasive species is an organism introduced outside its native range that establishes, spreads, and causes ecological or economic harm. Invasive predators can decimate prey populations that lack evolved defenses. Invasive plants can alter fire regimes by changing fuel loads and flammability. Invasive pathogens can wipe out foundational species, like certain tree diseases that transform entire forest compositions. Invasive species can also reshape nutrient cycling, water use, and habitat structure. The stability problem with invasives is that they can create new connections and remove old ones. They can change who eats whom, who competes with whom, and which feedback loops dominate. They can, in effect, edit the network. Climate change, driven largely by greenhouse gas emissions, adds an additional layer because it changes the background conditions that previously shaped ecosystem adaptation. Heat waves, drought patterns, wildfire weather, marine heat stress, ocean acidification, and shifting precipitation regimes all influence stability. But climate change also interacts with other pressures. A forest fragmented by roads may be less able to support species migrations as temperatures shift. A coral reef stressed by pollution may have less capacity to recover from bleaching. A grassland overgrazed by livestock may be more vulnerable to drought-driven erosion. These interactions matter because ecosystems often do not fail from a single cause. They weaken from multiple stresses that erode resilience, reduce redundancy, and tighten the system's tolerance range until a threshold is crossed. This is why biodiversity loss is not only about losing beauty or losing rare species, it is also about losing stabilizing structure. Fewer species can mean fewer functional roles, fewer alternative pathways for energy flow, and less response diversity when conditions vary. It can mean fewer buffers, fewer backups, fewer ways to keep functioning when the weather, the chemistry, or the disturbance regime shifts. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, known as IPBES, has emphasised that human activities are driving large-scale declines in biodiversity and altering ecosystems globally. The important point for stability is that these changes are not purely local. They accumulate, they interact, they reshape the Earth system's living networks. Still, it helps to keep this grounded rather than gloomy. Ecosystems are not delicate ornaments. Many are remarkably persistent. Many have already survived ice ages, volcanic winters, and enormous shifts in sea level. But past changes often occurred over long time scales, giving populations time to move, adapt, and reorganize. The modern challenge is speed, scale, and stacking pressures. If a complex system is pushed slowly, it can sometimes adjust. If it is pushed quickly, it may not have time to reorganize through ecological processes, dispersal, and evolution. If it is pushed in multiple directions at once, stabilizing feedback can be overwhelmed. This is also why the impact of human disruption can feel oddly uneven. Some ecosystems absorb intense pressure and persist, though often in altered form. Others can flip quickly. Some changes are reversible with time and restored conditions. Others create feedback traps that keep the system locked into a new regime. In a complex system, it is rarely useful to ask whether humans are harming nature in some vague global sense. The more practical question is how human actions are changing the network. Which connections are being cut? Which hubs are being removed? Which feedback loops are being strengthened or weakened? Which nutrient flows are being increased? Which disturbance regimes are being intensified? Which recovery pathways are being blocked? When these questions are asked clearly, the story becomes less preachy and more mechanical. It becomes about system behaviour. It becomes about stability margins and thresholds. It becomes about whether the living network still has enough structure and flexibility to bend, or whether pressures are pushing it toward break. And there's a strangely calming thing about seeing it that way. It replaces vague dread with specific mechanisms. It turns the idea of ecological stability into something that can be observed, measured, and understood. Not perfectly predicted, because complex systems keep their mysteries, but understood well enough to recognize the difference between a system that is wobbling safely and a system that is beginning to lose its grip on the state it once held. Once the mechanics of stability are seen clearly, it becomes easier to talk about repair without drifting into slogans. An ecosystem is not stable because it is morally good, or because it deserves it, or because humans clap politely from the sidelines. It is stable when energy keeps moving, nutrients keep cycling, and feedback loops keep the system within a workable range. So restoring stability is often less mysterious than it sounds. It is the practical work of rebuilding pathways. That is the heart of restoration ecology. Restoration ecology asks a straightforward question with a very unstraightforward answer. If an ecosystem has been degraded, how can it be guided back toward a state where it functions well, supports biodiversity, and can absorb disturbance without falling apart? The word guided matters because restoration is rarely a simple rewind. Landscapes change, climate shifts, species distributions move. Some losses cannot be undone quickly, and some cannot be undone at all. So restoration is often about re-establishing processes rather than recreating a perfect historical snapshot. A useful phrase in this field is reference condition. A reference condition is a benchmark used to define what a functional ecosystem might look like in a given place. Sometimes that reference is a nearby intact ecosystem. Sometimes it is historical data. Sometimes it is a range of conditions rather than a single target. The point is not nostalgia, the point is clarity. A restoration project needs a measurable direction, more native vegetation cover, more stable soils, improved water quality, the return of a missing functional group, or the reappearance of a key process like natural flooding. The Society for Ecological Restoration, often called SER, has helped formalise how restoration is planned and evaluated, including ideas like ecosystem integrity, functional recovery, and long-term monitoring. In practice, restoration usually starts with simple constraints. If the soil is eroding, plants struggle. If water flow has been altered, wetlands dry out. If invasive species dominate, native recruitment fails. If nutrient pollution continues, lakes and estuaries may remain locked in algae-driven feedback loops. So, restoration often begins with unglamorous steps that quietly change the system's options. Rebuilding riparian vegetation to shade streams and stabilise banks. Removing barriers so fish can reach spawning grounds. Reconnecting rivers to floodplains so water and sediment can spread naturally. Reducing nutrient input so oxygen dynamics can recover. Restoring fire regimes in ecosystems that evolved with frequent low-intensity burns. Even restoring soil microbial communities. Because decomposition and nutrient cycling are not side details, they are the engine room. Sometimes the most powerful restoration work is simply giving an ecosystem space and time once the major pressures are reduced. In some places, secondary forests regenerate rapidly when land is no longer cleared, and the returning canopy gradually rebuilds microclimate, soil structure, and habitat complexity. In other places, recovery is slow because key components are missing, such as seed sources, pollinators, or suitable soils. The speed of recovery is part of what makes ecology humbling. Nature can be astonishingly resilient, and also painfully slow depending on what has been damaged. A closely related idea is rewilding, which has several definitions depending on who is speaking. In ecological terms, rewilding is often about restoring trophic interactions, especially the influence of large herbivores and predators, and allowing ecosystems to regain self-regulation. The emphasis is on process, not gardening. Instead of carefully maintaining a landscape in a chosen appearance, rewilding aims to restore ecological dynamics and let them play out. The Yellowstone wolf reintroduction is often discussed in this context, though it is only one example, and it is not a universal template. Wolves affect prey populations and prey behaviour, which can influence vegetation and habitat structure in some contexts. In Europe, rewilding efforts sometimes focus on restoring natural grazing, allowing woodlands, wetlands and open habitats to form mosaics shaped by herbivory and disturbance. The details vary, but the underlying hope is consistent. If key interactions are restored, stability can increasingly be produced by the system itself, rather than being constantly imposed from outside. One of the most important ideas in modern conservation and restoration is that ecosystems are not repaired by a single action. They are repaired by rebuilding resilience. That means increasing redundancy, improving connectivity where appropriate, restoring feedback loops that stabilize the system, and reducing pressures that push the system toward thresholds. It also means accepting that some ecosystems will settle into new stable states under new conditions, and the goal becomes to support functioning, biodiversity, and long-term persistence within those realities. This is where the tone can stay hopeful without becoming naive. There are real successes. Wetland restoration has improved water quality and wildlife habitat in many regions. Dam removals have reopened river systems to salmon and other migratory fish, restoring nutrient transport between ocean and forest through fish carcasses and predators. Coral restoration and assisted recovery approaches exist, though reefs remain deeply threatened by marine heat waves. Forest restoration can reduce wildfire risk in certain fire-adapted ecosystems by restoring more natural stand structure and fuel patterns. None of these are perfect. Many require continued care. But they demonstrate that ecosystems are not beyond influence, and that stability can be nurtured by restoring the conditions that allow self-regulation. Then the view widens, and a different kind of stability comes into focus. Because ecosystems do not sit neatly inside the planet, they are woven into it. The biosphere, the atmosphere, the oceans, and the land surface form a coupled system. Plants and phytoplankton draw carbon dioxide from the air. Microbes and animals return it. Forests influence rainfall patterns through evapotranspiration, moving water from soil to sky. Ocean ecosystems influence how carbon is stored in surface waters and transported to depth. Even tiny changes in land cover can alter reflectivity, humidity, and local temperature patterns. This is the Earth system perspective, and it changes the scale of the question. Stability is no longer only about whether a forest stays a forest. It is also about whether the planet maintains conditions that allow forests to exist widely at all. Some of the most famous attempts to describe this coupling come from James Lovelock, who proposed the Gaia hypothesis. In its strongest forms, the Gaia hypothesis can sound like the Earth is a single organism with a purpose. That interpretation is not necessary, and many scientists reject it. But the useful core idea remains: life can influence planetary conditions through feedback processes. Over geological time, the presence of life has altered atmospheric composition, ocean chemistry, and surface conditions in ways that shape habitability. A modern, more grounded way to say this is that the Earth system contains biogeochemical feedback loops. The planet is not a passive rock with organisms sprinkled on top. The organisms change the chemistry and physics of the planet, and the planet's chemistry and physics shape the organisms in return. This is visible in the carbon cycle. The Global Carbon Project, for example, coordinates scientific efforts to track sources and sinks of carbon dioxide, including contributions from fossil fuels, land use change, and uptake by oceans and terrestrial ecosystems. These global budgets show that ecosystems are not side characters. They are major players in how carbon moves through the Earth system. When forests are cleared, carbon is released. When forests regrow, carbon can be stored again. When oceans warm and stratify, uptake patterns can shift. When soils dry or burn, stored carbon can return to the atmosphere. Stability at the planetary scale, then, is partly about keeping these coupled feedbacks within ranges that avoid large-scale regime shifts. There are known large shifts in Earth's past, including transitions between icehouse and greenhouse climates, and periods where ocean oxygen levels and circulation patterns change dramatically. Those shifts were driven by combinations of orbital changes, volcanic activity, plate tectonics, and feedbacks involving ice, oceans, and carbon cycling. The deep time lesson is not that catastrophe is inevitable. The lesson is that Earth systems can change states, and that is why the future of ecosystem stability is not only about protecting individual places, it is also about understanding trajectories. Trajectory is a calm word that carries a lot of weight. It means direction through time. A single bad year does not define a system. A long-term trend does. This is where long-term ecological monitoring becomes essential. The Long-Term Ecological Research Network, known as LTER, was created to study ecosystems over decades rather than seasons. That is important because many ecological processes unfold slowly. Soil carbon changes can take years to detect. Forest composition shifts over decades. Nutrient legacies can persist long after the original pollution source is reduced. Predator reintroductions can reshape behavior and vegetation gradually. Even when change is rapid, understanding whether it is a temporary fluctuation or a new trajectory requires time. Monitoring is also how early warning signals are tested in reality. If recovery from small disturbances becomes slower, if variability increases, if spatial patchiness grows, these patterns can sometimes hint at resilience loss, but they can only be seen clearly when data exist over long periods and when those data are interpreted with caution. Nature has always been variable. The challenge is telling the difference between healthy variability and approaching thresholds, So what do future trajectories look like? In some cases, ecosystems are likely to continue functioning with gradual shifts in species ranges and timing. Many species are already moving poleward or upslope as temperatures warm. Flowering and migration timing has shifted in multiple regions, creating phenological changes, meaning changes in seasonal biological timing. Some ecosystems may reorganize but remain broadly recognizable, especially where there is space for movement and where pressures are not stacked too heavily. In other cases, the risk of regime shifts is more serious. Coral reefs are one of the clearest examples, because marine heat stress can cause repeated bleaching. Arctic systems are another, because warming affects permafrost, snow cover, and fire regimes in ways that can alter carbon storage and vegetation structure. Drylands and Mediterranean-type ecosystems face risks tied to drought frequency, heat extremes, and land use pressure. Each system has its own vulnerability profile, shaped by climate exposure, internal feedbacks, biodiversity, and human influence. Yet there is still room for something that feels like cautious optimism, without pretending everything will be fine. The reason is not faith. The reason is mechanism. Ecosystems have real capacities for adaptation, reassembly, and resilience when given room. Restoration can rebuild processes. Conservation can protect connectivity. Reducing key pressures can widen resilience margins. Even small improvements in water quality or habitat continuity can shift a system away from thresholds. None of this is a guarantee, but it is real. And there is another kind of hope that is less emotional and more structural. The Earth is not a fragile ornament. It is a planet that has sustained life for billions of years through enormous changes. The question is not whether life will persist in some form. The question is what forms will persist, where, and how much stability and biodiversity will remain available within the conditions humans are now shaping. That framing keeps the outlook expansive rather than preachy. It turns the future into a scientific question about trajectories, thresholds, feedbacks, and resilience. It keeps the focus on what ecosystems do best: reorganize under constraints, keep energy moving, keep nutrients cycling, and keep functioning as long as the basic conditions of habitability remain within reach. In that sense, the hopeful glide path is not a promise of restoration everywhere. It is an honest recognition that stability is something nature can produce, and something humans can either undermine or support, depending on whether the living networks are given enough space, time, and structural integrity to keep doing what they have always done. Stability in nature is often mistaken for calmness, the kind of calmness that means nothing is happening. But by now, it should feel clear that the opposite is true. In ecology, stability is usually the result of constant motion, constant adjustment, and constant work. A stable ecosystem is not frozen in balance. It is balanced because it keeps moving. Energy enters, mostly as sunlight, and becomes living tissue. Energy leaves again as heat. In between, it flows through countless mouths, roots, gut microbes, fungal threads, and decomposing fragments of last season's growth. That steady throughput is what keeps the whole system organized. If energy stops arriving, or if it stops moving through the web of relationships, stability does not politely decline. It ends. And that web matters. A simple chain is fragile. A network is more forgiving. Food webs create alternative routes for energy. Redundancy gives ecosystems room to breathe when a species declines. Diversity widens the menu of responses to change, so the system does not rely on a single narrow strategy. Sometimes the ecosystem holds together because several species can do similar jobs. Sometimes it holds together because one species, a keystone species, prevents monopoly and keeps the system from collapsing into sameness. None of this is gentle in the everyday sense. Regulation is often built from predation, competition, disease, and limitation. Feedback loops do the quiet work of control. When populations rise, pressures rise with them. When populations fall, opportunities can reopen. That push and pull is not a sign that stability is failing. It is often the mechanism that creates stability in the first place. Disturbance fits into the same logic. Fires, storms, floods and droughts are not merely interruptions. In many ecosystems, they are part of the long-term rhythm. Stability is often the ability to pass through disruption without losing the core processes that make the ecosystem what it is. Recovery is rarely a perfect rewind, it is reassembly. Succession is the living world filling space again, rebuilding structure, rebuilding nutrient pathways, rebuilding the network. The modern lens sharpens this into a simple but powerful contrast. Some systems bend, some systems break. Resilience is the capacity to absorb change and keep functioning, even while reorganizing. But resilience is not infinite. Thresholds exist. When stabilizing feedback loops weaken and amplifying feedback loops take over, ecosystems can cross tipping points and shift into different regimes. A lake can flip from clear to turbid. A reef can shift from coral-dominated to algae-dominated. A dry land can move toward a more degraded, erosion-driven state. These changes can be rapid, and they can be stubbornly difficult to reverse, because the new regime often comes with its own self-reinforcing feedback. At the largest scale, ecosystems do not float above the planet like decorations. They are part of the Earth system itself. Climate shapes where ecosystems can exist, how productive they can be, and what disturbance patterns they can absorb. Nutrient cycling controls whether that productivity can be sustained and whether stability holds or slips toward a threshold. The biosphere, the atmosphere, the oceans and the soils are in constant exchange, with life both responding to planetary conditions and subtly reshaping them in return. So, the paradox becomes less mysterious once it is stated plainly. Ecosystems maintain stability because they are built to change. They redistribute energy. They adjust relationships. They rebuild after disturbance. They shift composition while preserving function, at least until pressures exceed the system's capacity to reorganize. And there is something quietly grounding about that. The living world is not stable because it is delicate. It is stable when it has enough pathways, enough diversity, enough space, and enough time to keep doing what life does best. Turning energy into structure, and then letting that structure transform without losing the ability to keep going. A forest does not stay a forest by refusing to change. It stays a forest by changing in the ways a forest can. A reef does not remain a reef by holding perfectly still. It persists by renewing itself continually, polyp by polyp, relationship by relationship. A stable ecosystem is not a paused moment. It is a long, patient process, and if there is a calm thought to carry away tonight, it is this. Nature's steadiness is not the absence of motion. It is the presence of 1,000 small corrections, happening quietly, all the time, keeping the world recognizable while it never stops becoming new.